So, a lot of us have been talking right now about these mysterious fireworks that seem to be popping up all over the country. And at first, I had various theories about what was going on because, of course, many of us have been locked up in our homes and wondering like how we can get out, how we can have a spirit of celebration. And so I was thinking that perhaps it was our youth who really had just been feeling very cooped up and just wanted to go outside and have this moment of expression that usually is more centered on July 4th. But this year it was different. It started much, much earlier. And just as the fireworks continue into the very late night, starting earlier, like around 6 p.m., and then just going all the way until 1, 2 a.m. I mean, you could drop in the comments and tell me what your observations of these fireworks are wherever you've been. Like, and if you haven't seen them, I think that would also be really interesting to share. I would like to see that later. But anyway, what we're seeing though is maybe it's youth burning off steam. Another possible theory of what's going on is that there's something behind this to draw up some divisions, to make people angry and frustrated. Because what I don't understand is how are these children, how are these youth having access to Macy's level fireworks on street corners? And I'm just wondering if this, if the fireworks are the new bricks left on street corners in certain neighborhoods. I don't know if you all saw that back in the earlier days of the uprising, but there were these mysterious piles of bricks that would be outside of stores and somebody would leave there for people to make use of. And I wonder if the fireworks aren't the new bricks on street corners. Another theory that we have is we're just wondering how this is all being sourced. And there's lots of language going out there, lots of blame for where it is. Some are blaming the protests, that we have fireworks all day and night especially, and that this is a form of harassment and we should blame Black Lives Matter because the fireworks are really, terrorizing our communities in some ways. Then others are saying that the call to defund the police may have led some people who, and I won't say who, but who don't like that proposition, to want to actually escalate things, to point out, well, if you don't want police, then you're not going to get anybody to investigate what's happening with these fireworks. And as we see, there's already being sort of a scale back responses to things like the fireworks, also to the nooses that we keep finding hanging in parks. Just found a set of nooses up, I think in Fort Tryon Park or somewhere. If somebody knows, let me know, but it was just last night. And the police are claiming that they're not investigating because they're saying that they are leftover piñata ropes. And so one of the things that I'm very curious about as we think through this moment that we are in is, who are we blaming for things? And what are we doing with moments of celebration? Because another theory I've heard is that it was Juneteenth. So everybody was just leading up to Juneteenth and they wanted fireworks around that. But these kids, if they had heard of Juneteenth before, which many Black people just, especially here in New York City, it wasn't a big celebration for the mainstream, right? I mean, it's something we have celebrated, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the ways in which we are commenting on and theorizing about how people celebrate and have moments of joy is something that we should very much be paying attention to. So I want to talk about Juneteenth. It's a holiday in my family, always has been. And when I was a little girl, what we would do is I grew up in Washington, D.C. We would drive out into the country, which for us was Chincoteague. And out in Chincoteague, Maryland, where, the horses run wild, where the mosquitoes are the size of your hands, and there are beautiful, areas of wood. The civil rights leaders and freedom fighters from the 60s who got together, particularly this group we were with was from SNCC, would draw out, out of the city, away from white gaze, and camp in the woods and celebrate Juneteenth together with their families. And anyone who knows me knows that I am not a camper, and I blame my parents for this because they don't like camping either. So even though we would be at the campsite during the day, then we would go to our motel room down the street. But anyway, we did go out into the fields, into, drawing out into the wilderness in a way to celebrate, so that we wouldn't have to do it in a way that would get co-opted by anyone who wasn't prepared to understand liberation and what it means to celebrate it without it being filtered through somebody else's profit seeking or misinterpretation of the moment. And my grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, Doc Edmonds, was born on Juneteenth, which was significant because he was born in San Antonio, Texas, not terribly far. It was far, but not terribly far from Galveston, Texas, where Juneteenth began. And in Texas, they took this celebration so seriously. And his parents, this was in 1917, his parents were in the midst of their Juneteenth celebration. Remember, these are parents who came one generation down from enslavement. And they were celebrating that moment when my great-grandmother went into labor, Clemmy Smithy Richardson, and gave birth to my grandfather. And that sort of grounding in liberation and Black joy was, I think, precisely what birthed this incredible civil rights figure that my grandfather was. And, what I just want to say about that is that when we figure out how to have authentic, remember, because authentic is our theme for the month, when we figure out how to have authentic joy that tries to speak to the truth of our experience and how we need to be able to celebrate from time to time. The question that Sarah asks, shall I have no pleasure, is something that we all need to reflect on. Shall we have pleasure? And I want to ask, who gets to have pleasure? Who gets to enjoy themselves and who gets ridiculed for it? Or even, ask the question as if they're not supposed to celebrate at all. Who gets to have a statue to celebrate something erected, a word I use intentionally, and who doesn't get to have one? And of course, we know that the statues have been coming down, but we still don't know what to do with problematic figures. And as I come just once more back to Juneteenth, part of the story of the origins of Juneteenth is how news spread of the latest development in the debate about what Black lives get to be and how Black people could have agency over their lives. And then there would be all these conflicting accounts, right? Like, imagine how news would have spread back then. It's not like you could turn to your trusted news channel if you have one. You couldn't go to Twitter. You couldn't even get on a phone, right? I mean, these are obvious things, but think about then, how did you find out something? How did you learn what was happening? And what I love are there were these beautiful enclaves of people who started to say, Black people who started to say to each other, we will be free. We don't have to be enslaved anymore. We are going to leave. We are going to flee from these places of enslavement and oppression, and we are going to seek our freedom. We're not going to be liberated by a white army. We are going to liberate ourselves. And so they drew into the swamps and the woods. My father grew up in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And every time we would drive down to Elizabeth City, from DC, to visit my grandparents or to drive out to Nags Head and to the Outer Banks where we would go every summer, we would have to drive through the Great Dismal Swamp. And Daddy used to love to tell us, or still does love to tell us, stories about the Great Dismal Swamp and how in its dismality, is that a word? In its sort of treacherousness, Black people found freedom. It was so awful to try to go through the Great Dismal Swamp that Black people were able to set up these enclaves of freedom down there because white people couldn't make their way through. And so eventually, because this became such a route to freedom off of these North Carolina plantations, where people like the Spellmans, if you know people from northern North Carolina, they definitely know Spellman. So there was a major plantation with a name that I inherited, where many people would draw themselves into the swamp. And there again, away from the places where the people who were enslavers and the colonizers would go, Black people found their celebration and freedom. So lots of people are speaking to us, for us, and about us in this moment as everyone is trying to figure out what these uprisings mean. And I keep coming back to it because this is a moment in history where everyone's going to look back at what church did and what church was talking about as the streets were filling with people. Or, a K-pop led moment stunned a certain someone. Or where our youth, so many of our youth, were part of this beautiful active resistance that we saw yesterday. And there are just so many ways that the old things are not going to keep going. They're just not going to be. And this then becomes a time to celebrate. Shall we have pleasure? Could we have pleasure? Can we have pleasure? And if I said the more things change, the more things stay the same, what I just wonder is that good news? And would it be reflective of history? I mean, we're talking about Sarah, who's, one of the first humans on the earth. I mean, at least generations back. And she still wondered, can I have pleasure? And I asked that same question. Is there anything wrong with asking for pleasure? I think it depends. Because we need to know if your pleasure depends on my captivity or my subjugation. And does my pleasure, I think we all need to ask, does my pleasure cause someone else systemic or personal harm? This is the main question with white supremacy, of course. Because there is pleasure in being supreme, perhaps. But is it joy if it's not righteous? So take a look at how this text is situated, and I encourage you to go back and read it, because it comes just before one of the worst stories of genocide in the Bible. And, it's Pride Month. I don't even want to talk about that story because it just doesn't feel particularly sensitive. But what I will say is that Scripture has been manipulated to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah in such a way that it causes people to feel as if God does not want people to have pleasure. I mean, it's one of the perfect examples of how that gets used again and again to speak against pleasure. But one of the questions I asked, just thinking about that, is do we have our pleasure, and look away as our cities burn? Or, as this story goes, because this is where it's about to go as Abraham is talking to the angels, do we do everything in our considerable power to intervene? And this is one of those times, one of those rare times, when Abraham actually really got something right. Because he started to wonder what the possibilities would be to use his privilege, his considerable privilege, his very special relationship with God, and to ask God for help, to ask God no, to say, God, no, you cannot do this. If there is one good person, if there's 50 good people, if there are 10, whatever there is, you cannot destroy the city. You cannot let them destroy the city. And I wonder, as we all think about our own places of privilege, how we may be able to make that form of intervention as well. We must ask, what are the possibilities? Or, otherwise put, what can we do to bring the sustained pleasure of another while living into the great joy of our collective liberation? This, I think, is the question I have for this moment. Shall I have pleasure? You bet I will. And so must you. Let's do it together. Amen.